The performance of some U.S. Army generals in the Philippines at the beginning of World War II was atrocious. The conquest of the Philippines by Japan was the worst major military defeat in United States history. After just 4 months of fighting, over 23,000 American military personnel were killed or captured, while embedded Filipino soldiers killed or captured totaled over 100,000. The soldiers fought well, but the overall defense plan was horribly incompetent, resulting in a rapid defeat by a smaller Japanese force. 3 important incidents demonstrated treachery by U.S. Army generals. The Japanese planned to attack Pearl Harbor and Clark Field in the Philippines at nearly the same time. The attack on Clark would occur 5 hours later at daybreak. American generals had overcrowded Clark with new B-17 bombers that were lined up at an attractive target. This may have been intentional to encourage a Japanese attack from its air bases in nearby Formosa, now known as Taiwan. General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. military forces in the Philippines. He received a phone call alerting him to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Heavy fog covered Japanese airfields in Formosa early that morning. Launching and assembling a large number of aircraft was impossible, so the attack was delayed. In the 9 hours that elapsed between that phone call and the aerial attacks in the Philippines, MacArthur did nothing and refused visitors. He followed secret orders from President Roosevelt to allow the Japanese to make the first overt act of war in the Philippines. U.S. Army Air Corps officers at Clark Airfield learned of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor from radio broadcasts, not from MacArthur in nearby Manila. The official American war plan called for an immediate bombing raid on Japanese airfields on Formosa. The U.S. Army Air Corps commander in the Philippines was Major General Louis Brereton. He went to MacArthur's office twice for approval to launch a bombing raid on Formosa, but MacArthur refused to meet with him. General Brereton knew the Japanese would soon attack, so ordered all aircraft at Clark to get airborne and sweep northward to search for approaching Japanese ships and aircraft. They found nothing because the Japanese attack had been delayed by fog. After a few hours, aircraft ran low on fuel and returned to Clark to tank up. Meanwhile, the fog had lifted over Formosa, and the Japanese finally got their aircraft launched and assembled for a massive airstrike. They arrived over Clark to find most aircraft sitting on the ground to refuel. The United States lost 18 of 35 B-17s, plus 90 other aircraft, and many more were damaged. Total casualties for the day were 80 killed and 150 wounded. The total cost to the Japanese was just 7 fighter aircraft. The Japanese landed its main invasion force at Lingayen Gulf and attacked south towards Manila, just as the American war plan had predicted. This was the only route that avoided mountains and could use developed roads. The Japanese assumed the Americans would defend choke points caused by swamps north of Manila. They were confused as the American forces withdrew westward into the undeveloped Bataan Peninsula. See the video link below about MacArthur's incompetent defense of the Philippines, for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor. The Japanese quickly captured Manila and then moved westward to Bataan. The primary problem for the Japanese was moving supplies and equipment all the way from Lingayen. There was no port or even pier available to offload supplies near Bataan, except the excellent port facilities at the Subic Naval Station. This is why millions of dollars were spent to fortify Grande Island with big guns to guard the entrance of Subic Bay. These guns included 2 large 10-inch, 4 6-inch, 8 3-inch, and 2 155mm howitzers. Soldiers there also maintained sea mines that blocked the entrance and had months of food and ammunition. The fort's guns were protected by concrete. Fort Wint was key to the defense of Bataan, as it was the only fortified and well-stocked defensive installation. Its guns denied the enemy use of the Subic port and could fire southwards to blast roads leading into Bataan. The Japanese would have to capture Subic and Fort Wint before attacking into Bataan. The Americans could have made this far more difficult by assigning a regiment to defend the mountain road leading to Subic, supported by the big guns at Fort Wint. These withdrawing soldiers could retreat to Fort Wint to bolster its defenses. They would also sink all boats in Subic Bay or take them to Fort Wint, so the Japanese ground force could not invade the island. The Japanese would need to assemble an amphibious force to attack from the sea, whose ships would face Fort Wint's big guns, sea mines, and PT boat attacks. Army generals had developed detailed plans for the defense of Bataan before war began and knew that defending Subic and Fort Wint was vital. Capturing a defended Subic and Fort Wint would have inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese and delayed their attack into Bataan for months. The Manila Island forts were vulnerable to attack from Bataan, so Fort Wint was constructed to protect Bataan. Yet Fort Wint and Subic were abandoned as the Japanese forces approached. The Japanese faced no opposition as they captured Subic and Fort Wint and bragged about all the food and ammunition captured there. Japanese ships soon entered Subic Bay to offload troops and cargo and bombarded American forces in Bataan. This was such a threat that U.S. Navy PT boats from Manila attacked Subic several times, doing some damage, but one was sunk and others damaged by Japanese troops firing from Fort Wint. No investigation was done into this gross incompetence that undermined the entire defensive plan. Some Americans called Frenchmen surrender monkeys due to the poor performance of their army in 1940. Few Americans know of the embarrassing mass surrender of thousands of American soldiers in 1942. Most were captured in the Bataan Peninsula after General MacArthur ordered them into a trap due to his incompetence. But the worst embarrassment was the surrender of thousands of soldiers in the central and southern Philippines who were not trapped nor starving. This was the Visayan-Mindanao force, commanded by Major General William F. Sharp, pictured here with his staff. He commanded forces in the central and southern Philippines, consisting of 3 infantry divisions that were spread throughout the region. The Japanese landed forces on only 3 of the large islands to the south. On the largest island of Mindanao, pictured, the Japanese defeated units defending cities, but most of the American force was still intact and capable of organized resistance in remote portions of the island. On the islands of Cebu and Panay, commanders withdrew into well-stocked retreats in the mountains, from where they planned to wage guerrilla war. Any effort to drive them from these strongholds would have involved the Japanese in a long and expensive campaign. Before Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered his forces that were trapped in Bataan and nearby island forts, he sent messages to relinquish command of the Visayan-Mindanao force and directed General Sharp to report to General MacArthur in Australia for orders. When he offered to surrender his forces, the Japanese commander told Wainwright that his surrender would not be accepted unless it included all American and Philippine troops in the Philippines. Wainwright told him, quote, "The troops in the Visayan Islands or on Mindanao are no longer under my command. They are commanded by General Sharp, who in turn is under General MacArthur's high command." After General MacArthur learned that Wainwright had surrendered, he immediately ordered General Sharp to, quote, "communicate all matters directly to me," and formally assumed direct command of the Visayan-Mindanao force. American officers knew that MacArthur expected them to continue to fight as guerrillas to tie up thousands of Japanese troops. The Japanese still insisted that General Wainwright surrender all forces in the Philippines, and he worried the Japanese would kill prisoners if those in the south did not surrender. There is no direct evidence that the Japanese threatened to kill prisoners. During the 1946 war crimes trials in Tokyo, senior American officers admitted that no threat had been made. The Japanese knew that killing prisoners at Bataan would ensure that no one in the Pacific would ever surrender, and that the thousands of Japanese civilians working in the Philippines or any Japanese soldier taken prisoner might be killed in retaliation. They also knew that General MacArthur, who had recently escaped from Corregidor aboard a PT boat, was the overall commander. General Wainwright made a radio broadcast to please the Japanese. announcing that he had reassumed command of all forces in the Philippines who must lay down their arms and surrender. General Sharp contacted General MacArthur's headquarters and repeated the gist of the surrender broadcast. A reply came promptly. Quote, "Orders from General Wainwright have no validity. If possible, separate your force into small elements and initiate guerrilla operations." The Japanese and General Wainwright assumed his order would be ignored, so flew his operations officer, accompanied by Japanese officers, to Mindanao to pressure General Sharp. For unknown reasons, General Sharp relented and sent messages to all units under his command ordering them to surrender. Most of his colonels objected, but only agreed after General Sharp lied and told them General MacArthur had approved and the Japanese would slaughter American prisoners if they refused. His second in command, Brigadier General Bradford Chenoweth, commanded 20,000 troops in the central Philippines. He refused to surrender without orders from both General MacArthur and the War Department in Washington, D.C. Sharp insisted that General MacArthur had ordered a surrender and dispatched one of his officers to pressure Chenoweth. He threatened him and other reluctant officers with severe disciplinary consequences if they failed to surrender their units. All American officers surrendered their forces, but most of their Filipino soldiers rebelled and deserted. Many others deserted into the mountains to fight on their own, to include dozens of American soldiers. This surrender was not poor judgment by General Sharp. This was treason. He disregarded direct orders from General MacArthur and collaborated with the enemy to trick his units to surrender. The Japanese brutalized and killed many prisoners anyway. Anyone who doubts these events can read the U.S. Army's official history, linked below. General Wainwright failed to defend Subic and Fort Wint and collaborated with the Japanese to cause the surrender of soldiers not under his command. After the war, Wainwright was promoted to 4-star general and awarded the Medal of Honor. General Sharp's officers were furious when they learned of his treason. General Chenoweth wrote that Sharp did not have the physical or mental agility to adapt to the situation, and it was pathetic to give him the responsibility of commanding combat operations. General Sharp was never prosecuted for treason and died soon after the war ended.